To help us with the ACC Power Rankings, we have a guest this time, friend of the channel, Matt Golden. Matt, thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be back. Glad that we're celebrating yet another Clemson win, and look forward to kind of diving into these ACC Power Rankings. As it's been kind of an interesting year in the conference.
Yeah, it's I know Clemson's competition's been weak, post Georgia, but it feels a little bit like the old days here, where we're just going in expecting to win, kind of just relaxing as Clemson jumps out to 17-0 leads. Before we dive in, I figured I'd put on my trusty ACC hat, see if you can keep a straight face for this.
Oh man.
So let's dive right in, and as I'm sure you've seen, I've got these broken up into little sections. So let's start off with the bottom three. As some folks may know, Matt writes for Shaking the Southland, and we split the Q&As, and we also split the ACC Power Rankings. So sometimes we disagree, and you'll see a little bounce back and forth depending on who wrote it. So these are my Power Rankings, and Matt, you are more than welcome to tell me why I'm crazy and wrong and everything was terrible. And we'll start with the bottom three. So I finally moved Florida State to the bottom. At some point, record has to count, and they just keep losing games. So I've got them on the bottom. Since Clemson played them, I'll let you jump in right there.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that they when you've only won one game, and that's against a Cal team that we'll talk about a little later, it doesn't look like they're very, very good at all. I will say I expect them to kind of move up because I think Brock Glenn brings a lot to this offense that unfortunately DJ Uiagalelei did not. And this is not me hating on DJ. I went into this season saying I would pull for DJ to do well as long as Clemson beat him, and it has not really worked well for him. I know there's talks that he may take a medical red shirt and play for a 6th year. We'll see what happens with that. But on Saturday night, Brock Glenn looked so much better, and the FSU just looked better, even though they didn't look great. They're still probably not a bowl team, but I think that if you're FSU, you got to just keep rolling with Brock. And who knows, you might win 3 or 4 games and you kind of build toward the future. But yeah, I understand them being at the bottom. I don't know they're going to be at the bottom the whole season, but I think for right now it completely makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. We'll talk more about Florida State when we get into the Clemson review of them, but I definitely agree with you about Brock Glenn. Certainly quarterback wasn't the only problem, but I think Brock Glenn showed a lot more upside and maybe even more moxie than DJ. Above them, I have NC State. We can gloss over them quickly because we'll talk about them when we get to Wake Forest. But they blew a game against Wake Forest at home as 6-point favorites. I think they're just bad. I think we were just wrong. Florida State, NC State, obviously the 2 biggest disappointments in the conference by far. Really high hopes for both of them. Florida State was the media pick to win the conference, and NC State was thought to be at least a dark horse at minimum, sort of in the mix with Clemson, Miami, and Florida State. North Carolina, they actually had them a little bit lower last week. They were tied with Pitt in the 4th quarter. I know they lost at home, but I'm not really going to penalize them for that because I expected much worse.
Yeah, I think UNC, it doesn't get much worse than a few weeks ago when they had 70 put on them by James Madison. So, anything is going to be better than that. The fact that they were able to go toe-to-toe with a Pitt team that's undefeated. I was thinking about this earlier, and we'll talk more on Pitt later, but there's a possibility that maybe that Pitt-Clemson game in November is the game day. It's the game day that week. It could be a big ACC game. So for UNC to be able to kind of hold their own with them, even though it wasn't home, definitely shows some sign of life. I think this is it's a program that is it's really in the struggles. This is probably going to be Mac Brown's last year. I just cannot imagine seeing this going forward. It kind of reminds you of South Carolina at the end of the Spurrier years. You kind of think that he may retire, and they try to move to a different direction.
Yeah, he wasted 2 great quarterbacks. Now he doesn't have an NFL quarterback, and you see them just crash back down to earth. They got to part ways in a nice, mutual, kind of celebratory way. They can't let this go on. All right, so above them, 3 more teams. You got Cal and Stanford, the former Pac-12 teams, and then sandwiched in between you have Wake Forest. Cal blew a 25-point lead, pretty ugly, but it also means they were up by 25 on Miami. Connected on some big plays, and maybe that speaks to Miami just as much as it speaks to them. They haven't beat any good teams, and it's not even in the same regard like Clemson, where they're blowing out mediocre teams. They're beating teams like UC Davis. They lost to 17th ranked Florida State. Their memes are funny, but I don't think their football team is good.
I would probably have Cal over Wake Forest and Stanford, just because I think Wake Forest not a very good team. I imagine we'll see Clemson kind of get back to form this weekend. We'll talk on that more later. Stanford, a second week in a row, they're just getting pummeled. This time at home by not good Virginia Tech. I think Cal's probably better than that. But you're right. I think this Cal team, there was a lot of overhype. I mean, I think they were a fun story. It's their first year in the ACC. Their fan base is quirky. They make AI generated memes on Twitter. It's great. I loved it. It's fun to watch, but I just don't think they're really all that good. And the fact that they blew a 25-point lead when they had everything going for them. They had probably the best crowd they've had at their stadium in years, and it's 2 a.m. Miami time. Those Miami guys are probably not looking sharp, or not. This is not Miami's, a game that Miami should be able to play better than you in the late game, and yet they do. So yeah, I think Cal definitely toward the bottom of the conference. Again, I'd probably have them over Stanford, but I think we're splitting hairs with that.
Yeah, and to your point, Stanford, I mean, Virginia Tech goes all the way across the country. They're playing in a practically empty stadium. Really the reverse of Cal. I got to give Cal credit. At least their fans showed up. Stanford was empty, and they just, from start to finish, outplayed by a very okay Virginia Tech team. Now, in fairness, Stanford did not have quarterback Ashton Daniels, who gave Clemson fits with the run game. But you still can't lose like that. Just totally blown out. It was 31-7. It was playing at halftime. I mean, Stanford was non-competitive with, again, very whatever Virginia Tech team. Oh, and I don't want to gloss over this because I thought this was awesome. Did you catch the end? I don't think many people did catch the end. It was on the CW, the Wake Forest versus NC State game.
I did not. I ended up not getting to see the end of that game.
That was one of the most fun finishes. I tuned in at the end of whatever game was on before I flipped to it. Hey, I'll catch the end. There was maybe 6, 7, 8 minutes left. And Wake Forest is driving. They're down by 3. They've got a chance to win the game or take a lead. There's about 2 minutes left. And they start getting really conservative and running the ball and getting stopped. They're going to just settle for a field goal with, 90 seconds to go and lose this in overtime. And Dave Doran for NC State sees what they're doing and calls their bluff and starts burning timeouts. So after second down and third down, he burns timeouts. And then, of course, you have the 2-minute timeout. So he's going to leave himself enough time to go down and get the game-winning field goal after Wake makes the game-tying field goal. Dave Clawson calls the bluff, goes for it on 4th down, gets it on a pass play, and now there's plenty of time left, so they only have to go 20 yards and they have over a minute. So they work their way down, scores just a few seconds left, and C.J. Bailey throws a game-clinching interception on their very first play from scrimmage after that. So just a gutsy kind of – I thought Clawson was going to do something overly conservative. Instead, he goes for it, and it pays off. So good – I like to see, when I don't have a rooting interest, I sort of cheer for the coach who does things what I think is the right way. So I was happy to see him rewarded. Really fun finish. Obviously, unbelievably devastating for NC State to lose to their rival at home. Wake's not even good this year, so just brutal for them, but really fun.
Really fun. And, Dave Clawson, even in years that Wake is not good, they've been fun to watch. And I think if you're a Wake Forest fan, especially now in the NIL era, I mean, we saw, Sam Hartman, great quarterback, and then at the end ends up going to transfer to Notre Dame. You're not going to be able to keep guys like that. I think if you're Wake, if you're a Wake fan, you just want to be fun, and that's kind of what they are, even when they're bad.
Yeah, that rivalry, it's not some huge rivalry, but I'd say it's one of the more underrated ones. I've always enjoyed that game.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's keep moving. So then I have Duke at 11. They only have the one loss to Georgia Tech this week, but I had them at 17 to start the year. I don't really believe in them. I expected them to lose to Georgia Tech. I was almost surprised it was as close as it was. Final score in that one was Georgia Tech 24, Duke 14. But I don't think they're good. And then Boston College, I did sort of buy into it. Maybe, folks, I had them as high as I think 4 in these power rankings at one point, and folks were saying that's not high enough. Put them higher. It turns out they were kind of fraudulent. The win against Florida State was awesome at the time, and they got a lot of credit. But turns out Florida State's terrible. They lost close to Missouri, and that almost was like a quality loss. And after they just about lost to Vanderbilt, and then they turn around and they do lose in a blowout to Texas A&M. That loss looks kind of bad. They beat Michigan State, which seemed decent. Michigan State's now lost 3 in a row. So that resume got bad quick. I think Boston College is just very fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're middle of the road. They're nothing too special. They're not, they probably I think could be easily a bowl team. But yeah, I think we all got a little too excited. In the beginning of the season, you always have at least one or two of these ACC teams that kind of jump out, look good, and it's like, oh, is this going to be the surprise team? No, we know this is probably end up going to be a Miami Clemson championship game, and Boston College is very average.
And Duke at 11. Am I too low on them? Are you higher on Duke than I am?
I get what you're saying in that they didn't really play a whole lot of teams, but on the other hand, I mean, they're 5-0, or they were 5-0. A lot of teams, didn't. A lot of teams aren't doing that, which I will give them credit. It's just hard to know with this team. I also gotta say that Georgia Tech team's pretty solid. So I mean, it's not like it's a bad loss, but I would probably have them maybe a little bit higher just because this is their first loss. But yeah, I don't think they're necessarily anything great.
Well, here's the next two. We got the two schools from Virginia Tech. I don't know if they've turned it around per se, but they've certainly looked better lately. And that Vanderbilt loss to start the season looked horrible. Vanderbilt's just probably maybe should have even beat Missouri, and now they beat Alabama, one of the biggest upsets. I don't know, maybe one of the biggest upsets ever. So maybe that loss isn't so horrible. The Rutgers loss still looks kind of bad, but they're decent. And I'm starting to think that trip that Clemson takes to Lane Stadium is not a gimme. And then Virginia, they do what they did to Maryland, and now they turned around and or what happened to them against Maryland, they've turned around and now done it to Boston College. Virginia was very competitive with Maryland, looked like they would win that game or at least take it down to the wire, shut out in the second half. They turn around and do that to Boston College, get 2 picks in the second half against Thomas Castellanos. Pretty solid win. Aside from Duke, I think I had Virginia either 16th or 15th in the ACC coming into the year. Didn't give Tony Elliott much of a chance, but look, he's winning games, and that team's not so bad.
Yeah, how about Tony Elliott? And I mean, I think this is really you're sitting at 4-1 with UVA. Definitely a team that I think is a pretty good chance to go to a bowl, which for them is huge. And for Tony Elliott, that's huge. Big matchup this week with the Louisville team that we are seeing isn't as good as we thought. We'll talk on them more later. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm kind of high on what Tony Elliott can do. Again, I don't think he's gonna, get them into the New Year's Six or anything, but there's a lot of good potential with them. That's been fun to watch. They've got a few former Clemson guys on that. So very happy to see that. Virginia Tech, still just don't know what to make of them. They did look rough early, and I don't know what to make of Vanderbilt. I mean, they just beat Alabama. They lost to Georgia State. I don't know what any of this means anymore. So Virginia Tech will be one to keep to watch. That game in Lane Stadium with Clemson, obviously, you always got circled because that's a tricky place to play. But they're starting to come around a little bit, but really high on what Tony Elliott and Virginia can do.
Yeah, and Virginia Tech, it feels like they've turned their season around, but it's not a ton. They started off 2-2 with losses to Vanderbilt and Rutgers, and their wins Marshall and Old Dominion, not great. They lost to Miami, so one of their last 2 games is a loss, but it came down to the wire, so you almost felt like it was a more victory of sorts. Then they blow out Stanford 31-7, so maybe they're starting to figure it out. Real test will be at home against Boston College, 7:30 ESPN game. I kind of think they're going to win. I mean, I have them higher in the power rankings of their home. So Georgia Tech, the Tech versus Tech game. So I think those will be big proving games before they go to Syracuse and then Clemson, which will both be really tough.
Yes, I think we'll know a lot more after that Boston College game. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So these next two, I think were kind of easy. Georgia Tech and Syracuse. Georgia Tech, like you said, I think they're actually good. They've got a really tough schedule, but I think they're a good team. Syracuse, they beat them head-to-head. Syracuse has a kind of bad home loss to Stanford, but nonetheless, they beat Georgia Tech. When Kyle McCord is on, they rely on him so heavily, but when he's good, he's really good, and they're pretty tough to beat.
Yeah, the Kyle McCord has been really great, and that was a fun game with them in UNLV. A pretty good little Friday night. Get the weekend going, so that was great. Georgia Tech, I'm excited what I've seen from them. Obviously, they had a tough loss the other week to Louisville, but I really like what I have seen from Brent Key so far. I've told people this. I said he kind of gives me some of the vibes of the early tenure of Dabo. He's kind of he's a similar situation, interim coach, gets longtime assistant, gets promoted. And I just think he's a guy that kind of knows how to recruit, how to work the intricacies of working at Georgia Tech. So fun to see what he has. Do I think he's necessarily going to turn into what Dabo has turned Clemson? And that's a big stretch, but I think that there's a lot of positive momentum going on in Atlanta.
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick vignette about Georgia Tech. It's kind of cool. Our church is currently meeting in where he goes to high school, and someone was telling me that Georgia came in and said, "We'll give you an offer and we'll give you all this NIL money, but you need to gain some weight. Here's your exact target," and then the offer is good. So we thought about that, and then Georgia Tech came and Brenke said, "I'll take you just as you are. I think you're great, and here's your huge NIL package. I think it was $500,000, and he cares about academics, so that's a huge plus." And he's at Georgia Tech, right? So over schools like Georgia, that's something.
Yeah, they are doing really well in the recruiting trail right now. I think Brent Key being a lineman coach is it's going to be an attractive place for a lot of those Metro Atlanta linemen. So, that could really be an interesting thing to watch over the next few years. It could be a place kind of how Dabo turned Clemson into wide receiver U. Georgia Tech might be offensive line U.
Yeah, I could see it. But the thing is, with a great offensive line, you start getting great running backs. If you remember Boston College from not too long ago, I think it was Andre Williams, if I'm remembering the name correctly. They built a great line, and they'd have these running backs just go crazy. So great comment here from Scott saying that Georgia Tech needs to limit the turnovers. They really kind of blew a game earlier this season just with silly turnovers, block punt, stuff like that. Up next, Georgia Tech has North Carolina on the road. That's the noon CW game, which should be a win. Then they get Notre Dame in the Benz. I think it's winnable. Here's
very winnable. Yeah, I think Notre Dame has looked pretty human and not particularly great. I think that's going to be a game that that would be a huge win in the Benz for them. So that'll be a really interesting one to watch.
Yeah, and if you can get Notre Dame out of the playoff, that opens stuff up to likely get two ACC teams in the playoff, which is great. I'm sure the SEC would appreciate that as well. Another comment from Scott saying he agrees with the rankings, but Florida State and NC State will be ranked higher by the end of the year. I tend to agree with that, but at a certain point, I got to drop them if they keep losing. But if they played UNC or Duke, I'd probably pick them to win, right? So that'll probably play out. And I love some of these comments about Florida State. Florida State is too high in last place, or Florida State is overrated, is literally the worst team. So a lot of hate people are piling on for them, and fair enough there. All right, this is where we might have some disagreement. I'll pull back up. Next two, I have Pittsburgh undefeated at 5. I have 2-loss Louisville running a 2-game losing streak at 4. Let me explain myself, and then we'll see what you feel about that. Look, Pittsburgh, they keep winning games, but much like Duke, they're coming off a year where they were, Duke was fine last year, but Pittsburgh is coming off a year where they were horrible. And, they beat Cincinnati, but it was a very close win. Cincinnati's not good. And they needed a extremely fortunate disconcerting signals call on their game-winning drive to keep that alive and go win the game. They eke it out against mediocre West Virginia. Both of those saying they're there's a little bit of just good fortune in there, and they're kind of a middle to lower tier Big 12 kind of caliber. And then they struggled with North Carolina, and yes, they won, but you beat one of the worst teams in the ACC. James Madison, like you said, put up 70 on them, and you're tied at 24 going into the fourth quarter. So I'm still hesitant. Look, if they keep winning games, that Clemson game in November at Pitt, where Clemson's kind of struggled, is going to be a big showdown. But I'm not that scared about it. And then Louisville, they have a win over Georgia Tech, which is better than anything Pitt's done, in my opinion. I think highly of Georgia Tech. Louisville's loss to Notre Dame, almost fluky with all the turnovers. And then I think SMU's good. I watched that. That was the noon game I was watching before I flipped over to Wake Forest, NC State. And, their secondaries aren't great. They made some silly mistakes. But I thought both Louisville and SMU looked good. And I thought with Kevin Jennings, SMU looked really good. We'll talk about that in a minute. But your thoughts on my 4 and 5 here?
Yeah, I feel like Pittsburgh, it's almost the kind of almost anti-Florida State thing in that I think they're worse than their 5-0 record, but when they're 5-0, you can't not have them in the top 5.
Right.
So we'll kind of see this weekend against Cal should be interesting. I know I'm a little higher on Cal than you are, and I think, it will tell me a lot about Cal, how Cal responds after just this completely heartbreaking loss to Miami. So, if Cal goes in and beats Pitt, that would kind of be very telling to me. But I also think after, you got kind of an emotional hangover type game coming for Cal. So it's possible Pitt's rolling out the 6-0, and you kind of have to really wonder, are they that good? Are they, what are we learning about them? Some other games they have coming up the week after, they have a Thursday night game against Syracuse. I think that will be kind of telling.
Oh yeah. That's big.
Then 11-2, they got the big game with SMU. So I think that will really give us a good idea of what these teams look like. But yeah, Pitt, just a team that I don't know where to put them, because again, they're 5-0, but it's like, are they actually legit 5-0, or have they kind of fumbled their way into a few things?
Yeah, I would be happy to be wrong. I'm not really picking on them, but I think they beat Cal at home. Like, as you alluded to, I'm not high on Cal, but then after that they go Syracuse at home, at SMU, Virginia at home, Clemson at home, and then to Louisville before closing at Boston College. They could lose 5 in a row. I don't think they'll lose all 5 of those, but I could see them dropping 4 of them. And 8-4 after last year would be great. So it's not a dig. That's why I'm a little hesitant to go ahead and I'm not jumping them over Louisville yet. I still believe in Louisville, but of course, SMU makes the jump. Did you have eyes on that game?
I was able to get some of it, and while I was driving, was able to listen to a good bit of it on the radio. Okay. So impressive stuff from SMU, a team that I think, when I was guilty of this with everybody, when they were announced as an ACC member, I kind of rolled my eyes and like, what are we doing here? They haven't been good since the 80s. They're not a team that we really, have considered to be our caliber, and yet they went into Louisville and shocked them, which, that very impressive. I'm very excited about what I'm seeing with SMU. They've got Stanford this weekend, who, as we're saying, not very good. It will be a trip out west. Good thing, though, for SMU, that's not the big body clock difference that it is for everybody else. It's an hour difference, I guess. So that will be interesting to kind of see. But it should be a team they roll over, and they'll have a fun kind of into the season. They have Pitt, they'll have Duke, they have Boston College. Little disappointed that Clemson didn't get SMU in this first round, in this first roll of them in the ACC. Now, when the schedule came out, I was like, yeah, Stanford, that's perfect. I've always wanted to kind of watch more of Stanford, just because they had some fun years under Jim Harbaugh. They had some fun years under David Shaw, but man, SMU looking really good, and a possible team that could be in the conversation for playing in the ACC championship now.
Yeah, I watched them early in the year against Nevada. I think that was a week 0 game, if I remember correctly. And then it was a loss to BYU. And I thought, this team's not that great. They're going to struggle in the ACC. And I think I was right in that they weren't that great. And they changed some things, right? They switched to Kevin Jennings at quarterback, who initially kind of inaccurate. He looked amazing against Louisville, running like dead sprint and then just frozen rope, hitting receivers in the hand. Huge threat on the ground, obviously, but pretty decent passer in that game. Offensive line, honestly, might be the biggest change, though. They were awful early, and whatever it is they did, they figured that out. That offensive line, they won the battle in the trenches on the road at Louisville, and that was a big part of the difference. Was that and Kevin Jennings just being awesome. A bit of a wacky game, as there were some big plays that probably the DB should have limited to some extent. But nonetheless, it was a great back and forth game. I thought both teams, aside from that, looked good overall. That's why I'm not really hesitant to have them 3-4. And you started mentioning their schedule. I wanted to park on this for a second. So after that game on the 19th, so this coming weekend, or that's after an open date, then it's Stanford. Then after that, to Duke, who we don't have that high. They host Pittsburgh. That's a big one to have at home. That's tough, potentially. 22 ranked Pittsburgh. Then they host Boston College, go to Virginia, which could be tricky, and they host Cal, who you're high on potentially, but I'm not so high. That's all winnable. They could run the table. I don't think they'll be perfect, but it wouldn't be shocking. They should be favored in every game from here on out, especially with Pitt being at home. that could be real weird if they're undefeated.
Yeah, it really could. And from what I was reading today, if you get a situation where Clemson, Miami, and SMU are all undefeated, it then goes into like a third party, creates a team ranking, and they pick the two best teams that go to Charlotte.
Right. It's something like the SP Plus, but it's a predetermined, pre-agreed upon third-party analytics company, which I don't know how else you do it. It's that, or you go by rankings that the committee makes. So I'm not sure one's better than the other, but yeah, it goes by all these tiebreakers of who has a better win percentage head-to-head, but none of these teams play each other between Clemson, Miami, and SMU. Then it goes to common opponents, but if they're all undefeated, they all have a perfect, 1,000 win percentage. So yeah, it could come down to that. I'm sure between Clemson, SMU, and Miami, someone will slip up. But SMU is a legit championship contender right now, and I would say one of 3 teams that has legitimate college football playoff aspirations.
In the ACC, that if we do get in that situation, they've got to be hoping that Clemson's one of the teams, because we know Clemson sells out Charlotte. Miami doesn't always sell out their home stadium, and I don't know enough about SMU's fan base. It's just not a big school, so I think if you're the ACC, you're kind of hoping you at least have Clemson, and then one of these 2 little private schools can play Clemson.
Yeah, but if it's an objective analytics source, then that's not going to help. I have been to a game at SMU. This was 2017 because Clemson was playing Texas A&M the next day. So my sister lives in Dallas, so we stayed there before the A&M game. And it was SMU versus TCU. I think it was a Friday night, and it was real rainy, and there was no one there. It was us and some Australian tourists, and not a single TCU fan from Fort Worth, and just a real smattering of SMU fans. So now that they're really good and they're in the ACC, I think it's a different ball game. But that was my experience at SMU.
Yeah.
All right. Let's take a look here. I've had Miami first all year from the preseason, and even last week when they just about lost to Virginia Tech, and I have finally flipped them, putting Clemson first. Your reaction, and then maybe I'll explain after the fact.
This is one of those that I do agree with. I think Clemson is the better team right now. If I was doing this rankings, I don't know that I would have dropped Miami just because they are undefeated. And I think the other side of that is that Clemson didn't look particularly great this weekend against Florida State. If Clemson had gone into Tallahassee and won 42-7, then I'm like, yeah, I think clearly you put Clemson over it. Clemson did what they needed to do, and I made the comment, and I think this is a really big thing, is that it's nice that Clemson is back at a level that they can go on the road, play a C game, and still come away with a 16-point win. Like that's, I think people kind of forget that during the Deshaun, during the Trevor years, there was a lot of times Clemson didn't play well, but it just didn't matter because they were better, and that's kind of where Clemson, is right now. That it's kind of refreshing to be able to see that, because this is a game that had similar vibes to the Duke game last year. You put up a bunch of great stats, but you don't convert. You get 2 kicks blocked, and the fact that all that happens and you still win by 16, I still think that's great. You're a good team. Man, Miami just a wild game at Cal, and I think while giving up 35 points and getting down like that is not a big showing to me that they're good, and the fact that you've had 2 weeks in a row that they've easily could have lost to a team that should not be as good as they are, and it's 2 weeks in a row that there's been questionable officiating. You really got to wonder with Miami, but it does also show a lot of grit and a lot of tenacity that they were able to come back down from 35-10, because Miami is a team that we always, especially a few years ago, there was questions of what's the culture like. Are these kids, that there was kind of thought that their NIL, they get a lot of kids that are coming to chase a check. And, when you have those kind of questions, you start to wonder when things aren't going well, how are they going to respond? And the fact that they responded to a 25-point deficit on the road in the biggest game in Cal Berkeley, possibly history, or at least in the lives of these students, is, crazy that they did that. So, I got to commend Miami for that. I do agree. I think Clemson is better right now, but it's definitely just they're both very good teams, and I think if this is the ACC championship matchup, it could be a very good game.
Yeah, and you know what? To the point of this commenter here, it might not be the ACC matchup. Miami has the toughest schedule left between Clemson, SMU, and Miami. They go to Louisville, to Georgia Tech, and to Syracuse. Those are three of the top half teams in the ACC. They're all on the road. They get Florida State, Duke, and Wake at home. If you're Miami, you wish those were flipped because those are probably wins regardless of where they are. I don't know, man. They could easily drop one. And SMU can drop one too. Maybe the tiebreaker will just be them. I say that and I sound a little arrogant, but Clemson obviously could drop one as well. But it's not a cakewalk for them. To your point, Miami has they're number one in the nation in total offense. Cam Ward is maybe a little too risk-seeking, but no one's as dynamic of a passer, not a runner, but as a passer as he is, just zipping in dig routes across the middle of the field. He has no fear in firing those off. And so they needed 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. Let's see what the score was. Yeah, they had given up 35 at the time. They ended up giving up 38. 3 touchdowns fourth quarter, just perfect drives because Cam Ward's that good as a passer. So they win 39-38. Impressive. Also, that defense is not great. They haven't played at Georgia, so they're undefeated, but also their schedule's more backloaded. So I'd pick Clemson to beat them, next week if it was in Charlotte. So I'm going to go ahead and making the move and putting them number 1. If you enjoyed this video, please help this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Also, if you're a pet owner and you live in the upstate, check out our sponsor, Ready Vets. They offer immediate walk-in care when your pet can't wait. They're open 7 days a week till 10 p.m. They're owned by 2 Clemson grads. They're located in Taylor's, just 10 miles from the Woodruff Road shopping district.